Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the AoE4 tournament tier lists. We have ranked a couple of tournaments in the previous episode, which you definitely want to check out if you haven't done so already. And now we will continue with the other major events of AoE4. As a bit of a reminder to the previous episode, the cutoff there is for the events is $10,000 prize pool. We have ranked 5 events already, and we've got a couple more to go, and we will continue that journey today. So let's jump into the early period of the AoE4 tournaments. I've kind of grouped these tournaments in a way. You will see at the end what system I used. But in this video, we will have a strong focus on the very early days of the AoE4 tournaments. Starting off, we have EGC Genesis. It is the first major AoE4 event in history. Just a weekend after the game was released, this event was held. $20,000 prize pool, sponsored exclusively by EGC TV after Microsoft wanted to step back from funding it. A lot of controversy there. EGC ended up funding the event all on their own expense. So the event happened, and it did feature a bracket of 512 people for the qualifiers. The entire event was single elimination, which is not something that's great, and as I've kind of alluded to in one of my previous videos, that's one of the things I consider a weakness when looking at a tournament. But you only had 2 weekends to play this. 512 people involved is something I consider a positive, especially because the game was very new, so you really didn't have like that power balance set up. You didn't have a lineup of players that would be obvious to include, so you wanted to give an opportunity for everybody to compete. A lot of players came in from StarCraft, from Warcraft, from AoE2. A lot of players that you never even heard about, to be honest, especially if you've started watching AoE4, let's say, beyond 2022. Even Aussie Drongo played in the first round. He got eliminated in the top 5-12, so the first round. That's where the top 5-12 meme comes from Aussie Drongo, by the way. There is an emote on his Twitch, top 512, that's what I wanted to say. So top 512, there is an emote on his Twitch, and that's where the meme comes from, pretty much. Now, some fantastic games were seen on this event. We had seen the emergence of Mista over here. He made it into the top 4. He got himself a lot of fans, and ever since then, he's a big fan favorite of AoE4. But when you look at this event, it's a single elimination only event, very short as well. And the thing that I would mostly highlight is that given these circumstances and given how short of a preparation time EGC had for this event, it was as good as it gets. But compared to the other events in the future, it was a little lackluster. Nothing special. The broadcast quality compared to some other games wasn't spectacular. Nothing bad, but when you have some A tiers, when you have some S tiers, I cannot give more to Genesis than a B tier. Moving on, we do have the SteelSeries Prime Cup coming up. An event that you may not even have heard about. If you want to check old VODs, very old casts of mine on SteelSeries Prime Cup, you can actually find it on my channel. Be warned, they might be clumsy commentaries. They date all the way back to late 2021. But I've cast most of the event on my YouTube, and I will explain why. So, this event was a $20,000 event sponsored by SteelSeries. It was in December 2021, so just a month after EGC Genesis. And it featured a bracket of 64 players, but only single elimination. That's already a bit of a red flag to me, especially because by that time, we had a bit of a power balance set up between the players. There were some other events in between Genesis and SteelSeries Prime Cup. But the hugest red flag for me was, and this is probably what kind of seals the deal with this event, is that there was no official English broadcast. Unlike most of the AoE4 events that you know of, most of them belonging to EGC, but even when you look at something like Red Bull, which does have an official English broadcast on the Red Bull channel, this event had no official English broadcast. Instead, there were some partnered casters. Now, Wikipedia is listing 4 people, including Django, who at the time was a German AoE2, AoE4 caster. He was actually kind of the organizer on behalf of SteelSeries. We had Nile, who was mostly doing AoE2 up until that point. We had Hera, who was doing an AoE2, AoE4 mix at that time. But he was also playing in the event, so his stream was more like a POV stream, not a cast. And then Marine Lord, who was streaming in French. These guys were selected as the official casters under whatever criteria. But you see, we have basically one French, one German. The official broadcast, quote-unquote, was technically in German. And then we had Nili, who was probably the most well-renowned caster in AoE 2, at least, or among the ones that were listed as official casters. But Nili's community was mostly AoE 2 folks. So AoE 4 people actually struggled to find this event a lot. The viewership was very bad compared to Genesis, and compared to some other surrounding events as well, because people simply didn't manage to find most of the event. All the official socials, to my knowledge, were linked to Django's channel, which was a German broadcast. And whenever you don't have a central English broadcast, it's always a challenge to find the event. On the positive side of things, that actually meant that my YouTube content got some crazy viewership because, that was basically one of the few places where you could find most of the event. Just a side note, but at that time, Aussie Drongo was streaming live on Twitch, and he was one of the largest AoE4 casters streaming on Twitch. He was not added to the official caster list. So you kind of see why the event had issues with the viewership. I do not want to base my entire decision on viewership only. But I feel like SteelSeries Prime Cup, I cannot put it beyond D tier. Compared to Genesis, which was just a month before that, it was an event that was a massive step back. No official broadcast, was hard to find. Again, single elimination bracket only, but due to time constraints, that's understandable. And when you look at an event like this, sponsored by a big hardware manufacturer, SteelSeries, you're definitely expecting a lot more. This event did not deliver, and as such, it moves into D tier. Now, looks like for every video that I'm making over here in this tier list, there is going to be an event that you probably never heard of. For this video, that is going to be Castle Cup. As I said, in this video, I take you to the early days of the AoE 4 tournaments, and Castle Cup is also an event that was featured in the very early days. It actually happened just a couple of days prior to SteelSeries Prime Cup, and this was a $10,000 tournament hosted by Grubby. The sponsor of the event is listed as Wisdom Gaming, but I haven't really heard about them, so I cannot really elaborate more on that. It was a one-day event only, 2v2 with 4 invited events, included 4 teams. One of them was Bonjour, which was a German channel, massive German channel. They were big on AoE 4 at the time. Sometimes they play still, so keep an eye out on Bonjour. There was Nili and Jim Rising. Jim Rising, a known StarCraft 2 player. Pig and Petit Drogo, 2 StarCraft 2 players. Pig also caster himself. And Hasu, OBS, and Trump. Hasu from StarCraft and Warcraft. Trump, well-known Hearthstone player. He was also big on AoE 4 at the time. I really cannot categorize this event well because it's just so off from everything else. $10,000 one-day event, invitational only, 4 2v2 teams, but to what avail? We didn't really have any of the relevant players at the time included. You had some good players, that wasn't the problem. But when this event happened, you already had some big names in AoE 4. Mista, Marine Lord, Viper won Genesis just a month ago. These guys were all there. Other people also who made it to the top 8s, Lucifron, Vortex, these folks were all available, and they didn't end up playing in this. I really don't want to rate this event anywhere else than MISC, simply because comparing a one-day event that was invitational only with some not so relevant players, and I don't want to be mean over here, I'm just saying, like, look, neither of these players really made it into the top 8 of previous events, right? Despite the fact that we didn't have many previous events, but still. I feel like a MISC is a decent placement for this event. Same thing as Glorious Evolution Cup. It's just difficult to compare to these major events, which features qualifiers, longer series, and, you know, the best players in the world. Moving on, we are going to take a look at the Winter Championship of EGC TV. Now, this is not to be confused with the Winter Team Championship that many of you may remember. This event was held early January of 2022, actually late January. It was early January is going to be Pro League, as you will see. Early 2022 Winter Championship of EGC TV. This was the second EGC TV major, and it came after a very problematic time for AoE4. As we discussed, we had these events, Castle Cup, SteelSeries Prime Cup, these events that didn't really gather that much of a viewership because of other reasons, I guess. But the even bigger issue was that the devs, after the game was released, there comes Christmas, there comes the holiday for the winter, and they've left for it. But the game wasn't really in a good state at that time. There were a lot of issues, a lot of bugs. The animation cancel meta was at its prime at the time, and this is something that I will talk about in one of my future videos. There were a lot of questions with the game, and the player base, as much as the viewership, started plummeting as well. So Winter Team Championship didn't really have an easy time compared to previous events, because as the game struggled, so did the viewership, and so did the available audience for the organizers. Also, some other pro players started to step back, StarCraft folks, some AoE2 folks as well, seeing the issues with the game, seeing how limited the map pool is, how dominant certain civilizations were at the time on the ladder. All these things contributed to a somewhat problematic event start, at least. Now, this was only a 2-day main event scenario. We had, I think, a single day of qualifiers, and it's only a single elimination event, very standard settings, nothing crazy. This was actually Hera's first win and only win in a major AoE4 event. He came over from AoE2 for a couple of months, competed at the highest level in AoE4, and actually won this event. Shortly after, he ended up retiring from AoE4, going back to AoE2, but he was playing very well in this event. He secured this win, taking down Marine Lord in the finals. Now, despite the good games that were available in the Winter Team Championship, the word I would use for this event is meh. I feel like this event wasn't anything special. It's just kind of that event that fades into the darkness. It was there, it was a fun event, but it didn't bring in anything crazy new, no new settings, no shocking results, nothing like that. And Winter Team Championship is just going to be one that gets put into the C tier. Moving on, we do have 2 Outback Octagons coming up. I decided to rate them in the same video because I think there are a lot of points that we can compare between the two. And we're going to start with the first event. First Outback Octagon was pretty much held right after the mods became available in AoE4. Dates back to, I think, April 2022. Mods became available about a month earlier. That's where the FFAs, the free-for-alls, started to gain a lot of ground. Mods were brand new, a lot of streamers, a lot of players started playing them. It was an intriguing new way to play. And as much as I said for Winter Championship that, you know, it didn't bring any spice, it's quite the contrary for Outback Octagon. What you've seen at Outback Octagon was a brand new setting, never before seen, and I think that was one of the strongest points of Outback Octagon. Ozzy Drongo jumped on this format, and he was able to get $10,000 sponsorship from Microsoft to hold this event. Now, as I said, the things I appreciated a lot in Outback Octagon was that it's a brand new format. It really revolutionized tournaments in a way. Just brought in something that was completely new and never before seen. But it had its issues. First of all, as far as I can remember, points were given based on placements. So oftentimes you see players just camping behind, letting other players be eliminated. We have seen a lot of camping, a lot of very long games as a consequence to that. There was only one map, which was Mega Random. That was pretty standard at the time for free-for-alls. It was also very difficult to prevent teaming up, and that was kind of a controversy that was looming around the event for essentially the entirety of the event. People have been accusing players of teaming up against a third player, all this stuff. and it was difficult to get rid of. As you will see, Aussie found a way to do that, but that wasn't really for Outback Octagon 1. Last but not least, obviously, as much as I do not want to blame events for crashes, because that's something that kind of plagues a lot of events, for these FFAs, they are a lot more problematic. They do reroll the entire map, the spawns, all these things. And especially when you have 8 players involved in the same game, crashes weren't uncommon, and I think that also hurt the event a lot. Outback Octagon was a revolutionary event in many ways, but it was extremely unpolished, and because of that, I'm putting that into the C tier. Continuing on with Outback Octagon 2, after a year of modding, and after a year of thinking over the settings, I think Aussie made a lot of very good improvements to Outback Octagon. The first event, as I said, to me it's a C tier, partly because it was an extremely unpolished event. There were a lot of issues with the event that weren't related to like the actual format of the tournament, but how things were arranged, how you could work around the issues that were with the game and such. But when you look at Outback Octagon 2, this event was a lot more polished than the first edition of Outback Octagon. $30,000 prize pool from Microsoft, 1 year after the original, just in 2023. And I think Aussie made a lot of very valuable changes to Octagon. First, I loved the idea of introducing kings and king snipes. One of the most problematic elements of the original Outback Octagon was the campy standards and the fact that it was difficult to eliminate a player. By introducing the king, you allow players to snipe neighbors very quickly, and it got to some very high intensity games. Oftentimes you saw players eliminated after 10-15 minutes, and players were indeed motivated to try and knock out opponents, try to knock out neighbors. Points were given based on kills as well, which was, I think, a great change. And because of that, we suddenly had a lot more of a higher intensity early game. It wasn't like the sit back and boom game, but there was actually a lot of intrigue at the beginning. Teaming was eliminated by Aussie, which is something I loved. Obviously, you can never completely eliminate it, but rules were made such that you can only collaborate with anyone if there is like a clear and imminent threat to both of you that you need to negate. For example, one third-party player having a wonder that's 2 minutes away, or one player having all the sacred sites that makes all the other players eligible to team up against that player to decap those sacred sites. I also loved how there were some special prizes alongside the placements, so it wasn't just about where you finish. You could get extra $1,000 for stuff like the best king snipe, the best wonder defense, the best sacred site defense. All these things incentivized players to play in a very diverse way, and I think it made the individual games a lot more appealing. We have seen some crazy plays, because even if a player didn't feel like I can win, that player could still try to go something crazy and try to play for one of these extra prizes. And we have seen some attempts to do that. The only con that I really have here for Octagon 2 are crashes. I know, once again, it's a little problematic to blame the tournament for crashes because it's really a game issue. But when you look at Octagon 2, one of the issues that we had is that sometimes a game had to be launched 4 or 5 times for it to work once. It wasn't really about the crashes that happened while the game was going on, although we had some stuff like that too. But whenever you had 4 or 5 crashes at the beginning, it always rerolls the maps. And sometimes players went from having a great map in the first try into having an absolutely terrible map. I feel like that's an issue. Obviously, it's not something that Aussie can really be faulted about, but that's something that makes the event be a little lower than S tier. I was close to putting Octagon 2 to S tier, honestly, because I think in its own category, it did the best it could. But as long as crashes are there and as long as they influence results like that, I feel like A tier is a little bit more realistic for Outback Octagon 2. With that being said, we're getting to the end of the second part of this video series on the tier list of AoE4 tournaments. We have 5 more tournaments to rank, and that will be done in the 3rd episode of this series. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you throw a like to the video, given that you've enjoyed it. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I greatly appreciate that too. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the third episode of the AoE4 Tournaments tier list.